we'll do a really quick review of some of the core concepts, the things we covered before. The usual suspects, components, JSX, props. We'll spend a bit of time just reviewing what we know so far, because some of these concepts are really important to understand. We'll talk about React functional components. And we use functional components as opposed to the old style class components. We all know that now. And we're going to do a review of JavaScript functions. You can think way back to weeks and weeks ago, we talked about functions. We'll talk about functions in a very specific way and closures. Has anybody heard this term, closures? This is an interesting, actually quite a fascinating topic, and that is how React and many of these other UI libraries work using closures. We'll talk a bit about the component lifecycle, and then this term render. You've probably heard this before, render. Oh, the component renders, the page renders, the screen renders. What does that mean? And what does it mean in terms of React? Then, of course, we'll talk about state and use state. And we'll do a bit of a game show quiz. Why did they call it React? And then we'll talk about stale state, because yes, state can go stale on you. And we'll talk about sharing state, and then how we can use functions as props, because that's how we share state between components. And we'll talk about a very important concept, interface versus implementation. And this is actually a critical thing to know, and something a lot of people don't code correctly in their projects, and it can cause them big problems, and you can dig yourself a real hole. Okay. So if you've just joined us, my name is Gary. I am one of the full-time course instructors here at Lighthouse Labs. I'm not a full-time instructor. I actually have a job, or 4 of them actually, plus 2 companies. So I don't teach all the classes, but I do teach a good part of the React program. I've been coding for longer than there have been Microsoft or Apple computers around there. So I think since the 80s, I started coding in earnest. Yeah, there was actually coding in the 80s. We used stone and chisels to carve in caves our code. I have not coded using punch cards, contrary to popular belief, but I have seen a punch card machine in the corner. I think I just missed it by like about a year or so. They were just tossing them out, I guess, at the university. I'm an engineer by education. Spent way too long in school. So, all right, let's get started. So let's talk about components. Let's ask a question. Let's pretend we're in an interview. And we'll ask the interview question, what is a React component? I give a lot of interviews at jobs for many different companies, and I tend to ask the easy questions, or questions that seem easy, but unless you're coding actively, you wouldn't really know the answer to. So this is a very harmless sounding question. What is a React component? Anyone give you a definition? It has a very specific definition. And it's very precise. There is a definition of a React component. One of my favorite shows, and I think it's required watching to be in this business, is the IT Crowd. Any IT Crowd fans in the audience? Yes, awesome show, right? Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yes. Have you tried turning it off and on again? Yes, that's right. One of my favorite episodes was Jen, the IT manager. Totally incompetent IT manager, was looking for a new job. She went for an interview to be a new IT senior manager of IT, right? And the interviewer said, "Oh, nice to meet you. Your resume looks fantastic. You're like, wow, you have so much experience. Start and have a quick talk." But I've always wondered, just can let me know, what does IT stand for? What does it mean? I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? She didn't know. Right? So it was actually quite funny. And it stands for integrity. It stands for, yes, no, yeah, you can't fake this stuff. So you might get asked, harmless question, what is a React component? For coding these things, what are they? What's the definition? Because this actually leads us into our entire conversation today about state, knowing what a React component is, and everything flows from this. Okay, it's a file that has a particular purpose, correct? The same function made clear, yep. It's a reusable piece of code, yep. Those are all true statements, but what is it? So a React component is a what? Well, let's take a look at a React component. I have app.js. I've got a simple one I wrote, very simple. There. So if I asked you a long time ago, back module 1 of the program, and I said, I've got this component called app. What is it? You could probably tell me. What is this thing? It's a function. Okay. So it is a function. Now we're talking functional components, not class components, of course. A function. Okay. But it's not just any function. It's a function that does something very specific. Back to the function. So it is a function. Okay. But not every function is a component. So what makes a component function special? Returns a single domino. Pretty close, yeah. It is a function that returns JSX. There. Returns JSX. So a function that returns JSX. There. If you get asked that question in an interview, you can answer that. It is a function that returns JSX if we're talking functional components. We'll talk class components next week or in a couple weeks, depending. Okay. There. And I want to stress, I guess I can't underline here. I'm going to put some stars beside that. Star, star. Do not lose sight of this, please. It is a function. And you can count the number of times I will say today, it is just a function, because it is just a function. Because we often get rather intimidated by React, thinking it's this magical thing that has these superpowers, when it's just a JavaScript function. And it has to behave like a JavaScript function. It can't behave any other way. JavaScript functions behave a certain way. A React component must follow those rules. Okay, so it's a function. So it returns JSX. So what's JSX? The next obvious question they'd ask you, oh, that's interesting. Well, what's JSX? Okay, what is JSX? Well, this is a bit easier. It's a markup language, right? It's markup language. I can speak language, but I can't spell it. Yes, it is an unholy abomination, quite appropriate for Halloween. That's right. It's really a combination of a markup language that is a combination of JavaScript and HTML. In other words, it is a template language. Just like EJS in TinyApp. We look at React, it's the same kind of thing. But instead of using pointy bracket %, we use curly braces for variables. But apart from that, it's the same thing. So if I make a variable here, constant, I'll call it title equals, and I'll say hello React. Instead of this text, I can, of course, put my title in there. But of course, I can't do that because I have to put curly braces around that, because whenever you want to render JavaScript inside a template, if you will, we have to use curly braces. So I should say hello React. Let's start my app. There. React state. npm start. I am using a create React app. I think you've all run create React app, or npx create React app, which is one way to create a React app. Turns out that is the way that is dying off very soon. And we'll talk about that a little later. I think we have a lecture on that. We talk about the workflow of React. And CRA, as it's affectionately called, is dying. It is no longer a thing. But for now, I've made one in React app. Okay, there. Hello, React. Look at that. It works. Okay. So I have my component with my JSX. And I can say hello there. And of course, Webpack, I'm in development mode, so it'll refresh automatically. Only in development mode because we have Webpack and Babel running in the background on my server. And when they detect a change, they send some WebSocket signal to my browser to update the screen. This only happens in development. We have a complete development environment that was installed for us using CRA, which included Webpack, which is kind of like NodeMon on steroids, and Babel, which does the translation between JSX and JavaScript. I think it's called transpile. We'll talk about that in a second. I love that word, transpiler. Doesn't sound like a TV show. Transpilers. Transpilers 4, Rise of the Machines, or whatever. Yes, okay. I love that word, transpiler. Just think of giant robots. Okay. So we're working with React functional components. Okay. So let's talk about functions. Okay. And what they are. Let's make a file here. I'm going to put outside so I don't get tempted to put it inside my code. I'll make a file called functions.js. Okay. Make myself a function. And what should I call it? Well, my function. I can't think of names. I'm terrible at that. So I'll just call it my function. Call it my function. There. Okay. And I'm going to make a variable. Let count equals 0. And I'm going to console log count. Or I'll say count is, just to be a little more eloquent at it. Okay. And I run my function. I'll say my function. And to call a function, of course, we name of the function and some round braces. Really simple stuff. We know this from long ago. So I run my function. And, oh, let's take a look in the right place. State function. I got 3 of them. That was kind of odd. Let's take a look. That was odd. Try it again. Is that just my eyes? Did I get it 3 times? 1, 2, 3. Huh. I think my eyes are playing tricks on me. Oh, there we go. Have one left over from before. There. There we go. Okay, try it again. Functions. That's why. Okay. Says count is 0. Makes total sense, right? Okay. So what if I did this? What if I said count plus plus? And I call my function 3 times. What do I expect to see? Let's take a look. My count is 1. Well, why is count 1? You can clearly see that I incremented count each time, right? So why am I getting 1 every time? Well, for a couple of reasons. First reason is, of course, I'm setting count to 0 at the beginning. So it doesn't matter what I do to count. When this function ends, then everything's destroyed. These are separate instances of the same function. That's an important point. They are separate instances. So this is one instance of function, second and third, and they do not share anything. So the count here, when I run this function, is not the same as the count here. It's a different piece of memory even. So nothing survives. When this function runs, nothing is left over from the function. And that's the important point. Nothing survives running the function again. Okay. And that actually takes us to the heart of why we have state in React. When a function ends, everything's gone, almost, except in one very specific kind of artifact or pattern we can use in React or in JavaScript in general. It looks like this. What if I had, instead of this, I had a function inside here? And I'll just call it increment. There. And now I put this code inside here. There. And I got to return something. So I'm going to return my function. Okay. So I call my function. Well, I'm just going to get back a function. Presumably, let's take a look. Const result equals my function. Let's console log what we get back. Let's take a look. So there's our function. It's returning increment. So let's see, does that in fact work? Oh, it says I get back a function called increment. Makes total sense. Okay. So I might as well call this, I'll call it inc, just to give it a different name. There we go. Console log inc. Well, inc is a function, isn't it? I know because it says function. Let's run it again. It's probably called inc this time. Well, it's called increment because it knows the name inside there. So I've got this function inc, which is the increment function. What do we do with functions? What's really the only thing we can do with a function? We run them. We call them. Yeah, that's it. They're functions. That's all they can do. So we're going to call inc. Let's just call inc. And what should I see? Let's take a look. If I call inc, count is 1. Makes total sense. Count was 0, count plus plus, count is 1. Okay. What if I call inc 3 times? What am I going to see? Well, I'm calling 3 times. I get 1, 2, 3. Oh, interesting. So it looks like our initial statement where nothing survives running a function is not quite true. It's almost true, but not quite true. My function is now over, but JavaScript notices that we're still keeping a reference to something inside my function, this increment function. So it holds on to that. This is called a closure. It's a closure. So if someone asks you in an interview, what is a closure? A couple of answers, but really the answer is it's a function inside a function. That's what it is. And the outer function returns the inner function. That's a closure. There's more to it than that, but that's a perfectly acceptable answer in an interview, one I would totally accept. It's a function in a function, and the outer function returns the inner function. You can talk about, yeah, and of course, it holds on to the scope. It doesn't destroy the function, and anything in scope comes along for the ride. In other words, because increment is now being held on to, and increment is talking to count, JavaScript also, I must have to keep this around as well. So these are all in scope still, so it hangs on to these so they can be used later. And that's the concept of closure. It's kind of a weird one. It's got some really cool effects, and that is what React is based on. The fact that this works. This is how React works, and why we can do things, because we can have functions inside functions. Okay. So let's make this a let, and let's do this again. There. I'm going to call inc again. And then I'm going to call inc, inc, inc. Okay. What's going to happen now, do we think? What do we expect? Do we expect 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6? Or 1, 2, 3, and crash? Crash is always a good bet with my code, by the way. Just so you know, always vote crash if you have the choice, okay? Take a look. What do I get this time? Well, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Because now this is a new instance of my function. And we know that nothing survives a whole new instance of the function. So this is fine. Hang on to this inc here. But when I call the whole function again, now it builds everything from scratch, a brand new count and a brand new increment. Now I could do this. I could go inc1 and let inc2. And if I call inc1 again, I know this gets scary after a while. What's going to happen now? Let's take a look. Well, I get 4, 5, 6 because it was still in scope. These are different instances. Important to note, different instances, it's the same function. In other words, this is a template of what I want to do, and this is me doing it. So I'm calling my function 2 times using this as my guide, essentially. Okay. So this is the kind of fun thing about closures. They're kind of weird, and they have some cool uses, but certainly in React, we use them an awful lot. Okay. So how does this relate to things like components? Well, let's take a look at a component. This is a component, and I can make another component. I can make a component in a file, or I can make it in line here. Let's make ourselves a component. It's a function. I'll call it title. There. Okay. And I'll put in my title, this. There. H2 title. Maybe I'll put a div. I just feel like doing some fun stuff here. Try div. There we go. I'll put this inside here. And we know that we have to have the single parent rule. You cannot have orphans in React. All children must have parents. That's one of the rules. So if I try to put something like this, I'm breaking that rule. Hold on. Let's put this there. It won't like that, right? It'll just say you're breaking the single parent rule. All children must have parents, because we know that Facebook was written Facebook originally wrote React, and React, being the world's most philanthropic and family-friendly organization, they do believe that all children should have parents. Okay, so at least you can't have orphans, right? There's H title, and I've got a function called title. It looks like this is a component. It is a function and returns. Oops, let's put our round braces here. Now, this is a good point. Why do I have to do this? Why put the round braces? Why not just do this? Why not this? Will this work? Well, this won't work. I'll get nothing. In fact, if I try to call my component, this is not going to work. In fact, it's grayed out. It says unreachable code detected if I hover over all this code. Unreachable. But if I do this, it works. Okay. And yes, thank you, Mitchell. It is automatic semicolon insertion. We do know that semicolons are optional in React. So if you haven't got one, it just puts one there for you. It assumes you wanted a semicolon. So we can't do this. So we can either do this, which just looks ugly. Go ahead and put that div there. That looks ugly. I hate that. Or I prefer just putting some round braces. And that guarantees that all this stuff will be in the return. And that's why I'll see these round braces sometimes. Or this works too, but I prefer using the round braces. Now it is a component. It is a function that returns JSX. And I can use my function. I can go here and instead I'll put 2 of them here. Like let's say hello. Let's put some text for now. Hello, new title. There. And I can put my title here. We would normally do this. We'd go title, and we'd use pointy braces to call our component function. There, okay, and hello new title. No surprise, of course. But this is just a function, isn't it? This is just a function. And I know that I can call functions. How do I call a function? Well, I call the function by the function name and using some round braces. So what that means is, why don't I simply do this? Curly brace title. And call my function. like that. This is JavaScript, and this is the function. Does that work? And yes, it does. There. Works totally exactly the same. There's no difference. I'm calling my function. Once again, title, although it is a React component, it is also just a JavaScript function, which means I can call this. I've got JavaScript, so curly braces, and I can call title as a direct function, which, by the way, is exactly what Babel does for you. Okay. Now, we usually call components like this. We go pointy bracket title, don't we? It is cleaner, but these two are identical. There is no difference between this and this. Babel, the transpiler converts this into this when it transpiles things into JavaScript and HTML. All right, let's explore this a bit. This is kind of cool. This is a function. Okay, so what if I want to pass something to this function? We're talking way back, beginning of Lighthouse. I want to pass some, we'll call it a parameter, for lack of a better word. I want to pass a parameter to my function. Well, I pass a parameter. Inside the round brace, I'd give it something. I'd give it a string, and I say, hello, Halloween. Yes. Just thought of a random word I thought of today. Halloween. Okay. Hello, Halloween. Okay, there's my title. I've passed a parameter to my title function. So, of course, I probably should accept that as a parameter, text, and I can probably render my text just like this. Makes total sense, right? And that works. No reason it shouldn't work because it's a function, round braces, passing a string, function, takes parameter, string, and uses it. It's just a function. There is no magic happening here. Do not fall in the trap of thinking that React is somehow magic. It's a function. It has to behave just like a function. I give it a parameter, it gets that parameter. Okay. But what if I want to pass more than one parameter to my title function? Well, it's a function. I would give it a second parameter. Boo. There. Okay. It's Halloween. Okay. I'm passing two parameters. Well, I can accept two parameters. Text 2. There. And I'm going to put my text to, I'll put in a second line. There. I'll call this text 2. I'll call this an H3, maybe make it a little smaller. There. Okay. Boo. Of course. This should come as no surprise. It's just a function, right? Parameter 1, parameter 2, text 2, totally makes sense. But what if I want to pass only one parameter and only the second parameter? I don't want to pass. I just want to pass boo. Well, I can't do this because it's going to treat that as my first parameter. So I want to be able to have optionally return one or more, or maybe an unlimited number of parameters to my function. And doing it this way, well, these are in order. This is parameter 1, this is parameter 2, and they're always in the same order. So what's a better choice for passing a collection of things to a function? What would be a better choice? Give me some suggestions. What do we think? An object? Yeah. An array? An object? Yeah. Something that can hold more than one thing. I'm going to pass an object. Just jumped into my head here. I'm going to pass an object instead. So we're going to give our title function an object, and we'll call it text. And we'll say happy. Is that spelled correctly? I think it is. Okay. And text 2. Boo. With 2 O's this time. Yeah. Same thing. And of course, now my function now takes an object. So I'll say obj. Well, of course, now it's obj dot and obj dot. Of course, right? Just like I would do normally. Obj dot text2. Okay. Exactly the same thing. No surprise. This, of course, worked. I'm just passing now an object. Okay. So this is also what React does for us. Now, of course, we don't normally call components this way. We could, nothing saying we can't do that, but this is kind of ugly. It's awkward and not really very HTML or XML-ish, is it? Instead, I like to pass this as markup. So what I would do instead, I'd probably pass my parameters, call my title. This way, well, I can't do this, right? I can't put parameters here. That just does not work in XML, does it? So instead, I pass parameters to markup by using what are called attributes. So I'd say text, instead of text colon, happy Halloween. That doesn't work. I'd have to go text equals. There. But it's kind of close, colon equals, kind of close on the keyboard, almost the same, okay? And the same with text2 equals boo2, just to make it more clear. There, okay. I got the same thing. So these are identical in how they function. In fact, this is what Babel does. When you give it this, it converts it into this. And this is how we usually call components with attributes, okay, or parameters to the component, text and text2. And of course, inside a component, we can call this obj, but we usually use a more common name. What's the more common name for obj here? We'd call it something else, wouldn't we? What would we call it? We call it props, exactly. We'd call that props, okay? Props.text and props.text2. So really, props is whatever is on the left side is the name of the prop of the equal sign, and the right side is the value. So props.text. So props.text is Happy Halloween, okay? It takes a bit of practice getting used to props, but after a while, they become second nature. Just bear in mind, there's nothing magic happening here. These are just parameters. One is called text and one is called text2. So it's props dot those things. Okay. Something else. This is pretty good. Leave that there for now. I'll just take this because we don't normally call their components as functions. We call it like this. There we go. And I'll just say hello state or hello React state. There. I will only render one for now. Okay. That was kind of a long way to get to this part. Okay, so let's talk about how to render something else. Let's make ourselves a count. Let count equals 0. Kind of like our closure wrote before, we'll make a count. Okay, the count equals 0. In fact, let's take this code. Let's copy this, and why don't I take this code as well? And I'll put that inside my app as well. There. Count is count. I'll leave it in there for now. Okay. So now I've got a function or component app, and I've got a function inside that. One could say this is a closure. Not commonly referred to that as in React, but it is actually a closure. Okay. Now I want to somehow call this increment. What I want to do, let's render my, let's put a div here. I'll do a count. Put my count right here. And I should get 0. No surprise. I'm going to put a button there. And I'm going to say on click, which is an event handler. And I'm going to say I'm going to call my increment function. And let's put a plus sign right there. Okay, look at that. Okay. And I click and nothing happens. Huh. Let's go to our dev tools. Let's just watch what's going on here. Gotta clear this out. Looks all good, no errors. Okay, let's click plus. Count as 1, 2, 3. Oh, look at this, it's all working. Well, what's going on? It's not changing on my page, but count is clearly 5 right now. 6, 7, 8, 9. I can click all day, nothing's gonna change. Maybe I just made a mistake. Do it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nope, it's not changing. So for some reason, I'm not rendering, I'll hear the term later, I'm not rendering 5, I'm still rendering 0 in my code. So why is that? What's going on? Well, let's talk about this concept of render. Using that word render, what is a render? Great interview question. Okay, so what is a render in React? Great innocent sounding interview question. Okay, what is a render? Well, let's go back to question number 1. What is a React component? Well, it's a function. Okay, it's a function. So the component is a function. So that should give us the answer. Since a component is a function, what is a render? We talked about this. It's a function. What's the only thing we can do with functions? It can't be anything else but call the function. Yes, thank you. Exactly, Kenny. Call the function. It couldn't be anything else. Call the function. Okay, but what part of the function? Like this part? Well, how is that possible? We can't do that. There is no mechanism in JavaScript to simply call part of a function. You got to call the whole function. That's all we can do. There is no mechanism in JavaScript to say, call this function, but start on line 22. You can't do that. It's not possible. You run the whole thing over again. That's a render. Okay, in fact, if I log rendering app, in a rendering app, we should see rendering app. It rendered once. 2, 3, 4. Nothing changed on the browser because it didn't render again. Nothing rendered. Render means to also display on the browser. We know from our previous React lecture, we got this thing called the virtual DOM, and when we make changes to virtual DOM, React notices the change and sends those changes to the browser. And only the changes, not the whole thing, which makes it very fast. Nothing on the browser changed, which means nothing in the virtual DOM changed, which means no render happened. Okay, so what causes a render then? Since we didn't render, how do I get a render? Well, I want one of those things. How do I get one of those renders? What causes a render? So the next great question would be, okay, we know that. Well, what causes? You can see these innocent interview questions building up on us now, right? They start really innocent. What causes a render? We know what a render is now. It is run the whole function. But what causes a render to happen? And this is the core of React. What causes a render to happen? Because nothing's changing on my screen. A classic React bug. We always get these calls saying, nothing's showing up on my screen. It's not rendering. Well, what causes a render? Listen to an event? Kind of, yes. But what causes a render is the very title of this lecture. State. Or more specifically, a update of state or a change of state. Let's write that down because it's a critical thing. Change of state with an exclamation mark. Okay, a change of state. Okay, well, let's look at our code here. We have our little app function. Let's say I could somehow magically force a render. Let's say there's some kind of magical render function. Please don't do this. Okay. This is imaginary. It doesn't exist. Well, kind of does, but that's for later. Okay. If we could somehow force a render to happen, okay, sounds good. We force a render to happen. What's going to happen if I force a render? Well, I click plus, force a render. What's a render? It's going to run the entire function over again, which means let count equals 0. So even if I could force a render, I'm back to 0 again. It's the same problem all over again, right? From before, remember without the closure? There. Oh, hold on, there. There, it's the same problem. It doesn't survive. So this count does not survive another invocation or another instance of this function. It's gone. And we get everything new. This is important to note. Everything is new every time you render a React component. That's a brand new title. It's a brand new function. The old one's gone. It was out of scope. It's deleted. You build a new function. You build a holy return with a new div, a new title, a new count, a new button. Everything is new, which is very cool in React to think of. Everything you see on the screen is completely new. It's been re-rendered. So even if I could force a render, I'm getting to 0 anyways. So because my count did not survive. So for that reason, in functional components, we had to have some mechanism for a variable or stuff to survive a render. And that is called what? What concept do we have in React so stuff will survive a render of a functional component? The name of this lecture. State. Yes, it is state. That's what state is. So things will survive. And we know we would do this, right? We'd put some state. I'll put it here. We go use, I think I've got I do have a snippet. Anybody use snippets in VS Code? Really, really handy. You can go into your VS Code. It's kind of cool. You can go into File and Preferences or Code Preferences, depending. And we've got this snippets. You can make these. I've got a couple of them. Let's pick a JavaScript one there. And I use state. There. Look at that. And I use, in fact, I've got a couple cool ones, or just make a function. So if I type use, it'll put all that stuff for me. I like that because I'm just a lazy typist, right? So I can go use and pick use state. And I'll say count and set count. There. Okay. Now I better import use state. Now here's a cool trick as well. If you want to import some, you can type, but I hate typing and I always make mistakes. Go to the end of that, go control space. It'll auto import for you. Very cool feature. Saves you a lot of typing. I always forget my imports all the time. Okay, so now I have count here. Okay, what's going to happen now? Got my state. Great. So now it's going to survive my render. And looks pretty, no errors. Okay. Getting a blank there. What's going on with that? Let's take a look. Ooh, invalid assignment to const count. Oh, of course. Count's a const. You can't do plus plus on a const. Now I can make this a let, but we shouldn't. Instead, I have to use something different. I have to use the second part of my use state. I get back a function. So when you call use state, it gives you back two things. You get back an array with two things in it, a value and a function. And you probably should give it an initial value, because if you don't, like I did, you end up with undefined, and undefined does not render. Some things don't render in React. Booleans don't render. Undefined doesn't render. And of course, empty strings don't render as well, right? So I almost always give my use state a value, and now it renders. Okay, but I can't do count plus plus. I have to call set count to count plus one. Now we've done this, of course, in our work previously. This is all or count plus, oops, count plus 1 there. Okay, so now it does work, no surprise. And now every time I click, it renders my app every single time because I have a change of state. There, counter 6, render app. Counter 7, render app. Counter 8, render app, and so on. So it is working. Okay. So this is so important. You will not get a render unless you change some state because a render is caused by a change of state. And a render is running the whole function over again, which of course destroys everything. This all gets destroyed. The whole thing is gone and you get brand new everything. Is there we go. New count, new title, new function, new everything. All right. So that's kind of the core of state. And the reason we have use state is because our components are functions. And when you run functions again, you lose everything. So let's take a really quick break. So hopefully now everyone can answer our questions about what is a component, what is JSX, what's a closure, what is a render, and what causes a render. Because these are really important concepts to understand when you're coding React. Because what will invariably happen is something won't change on your screen, and you're going to wonder why. And chances are it's because there was no change of state. So let's do a little bit of a quiz here. Why did they call it React? Let's make some fun choices. So we'll do A. We'll say a cool name, not offensive in any language. At least I think it is. Language. Okay, that's choice A. Okay, we'll take a vote from the studio audience. Choice number or choice B will be A. Mark Zuckerberg, Fever Dream. He woke up one night, React. We're going to call it React. It could happen, right? It's like Meta. We're going to call it Meta. Yes. Totally could happen. So who knows what it'll wake up with next time. Okay. Or it describes exactly what it does. So who votes A, B, or C? I'm pretty sure B's in there someplace. You can always vote more than one, by the way. I'd vote probably B as my first choice and maybe another one as well. So, or all three is always a good choice as well. So yeah, I'm really leaning towards B, but it really also does describe what it does. Of course, that's what it does. React reacts to changes of state. If you change some state, React notices that and re-renders. Yes, I should have put D or crash. Good point. Yes, D crash. Definitely vote D. That's what React does. And I wish someone had told me that when I started coding React, because I was like, why is my screen not changing? Nothing's happening. It describes what it does. In fact, as a React developer, everything we do, every line of code we write, every function always ends up with a change of state. Whatever you do in any function, it had better have a set state in it somewhere. If not, nothing's going to change. Now, this is a very simple function, and sure, it has set state now at the end. It may have a whole bunch of code, maybe just 100 lines of code in that function, but it had better have somewhere in it a change of state. Otherwise, that function doesn't do anything. And virtually every function you write, every callback function, every helper function sometimes will usually have a change of state, a set state function in it somewhere, or nothing will happen. This is the core of React, set state, in this case, set count. And of course, we know this particular format of use state. This is one of the primary React hooks, hooks just being a fancy name for a React function. And it returns obj. In fact, like this, obj, or sorry, array, const array equals. So the use state function returns an array. It's an array with two things. I could say const count equals array 0 and const set count equals array 1. The very same thing, but we don't normally see it this way. Instead, we do what's called array destructuring, and it's called this way. You might be asked that question, because I do in interviews, what is array destructuring? Well, it's where you take an array, which is this, and you break it down into its components, and you give those components names. And these names are, of course, arbitrary. In this case, I'm calling this count and set count, but this could be anything. This could be ghost. There, count and ghost. And then I call the function ghost. Does it work? Of course it does. It's just a name of the function. You can give a function any name you want, but the convention is something and set something. So in this case, it's count and set count. Just a very common pattern. So try not to deviate from that. Count, set count, dog, set dog, ghost, set ghost. Okay. So that's why they call it React. React reacts to changes of state. When you code something, you change some state, and the browser changes as a reaction to that change of state. Okay. Let's talk about something else interesting. What if I want to add some cool feature to my cool app here that increments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? I want to increment by 2, not just 1. That sounds fun. I'm going to do that. Well, the easy way, I'm just going to call set count twice. There. I'll do two set counts. Why not? You can call as many set state functions as you want anytime you want. I'm calling set count twice. Reset back to 0. There. Okay. But it's only going up by 1. What on earth is happening? Maybe I didn't refresh properly. Try it again. 1, 2, 3. No. I expected to see 2, 4, 6, 8, but I got 1, 2, 3, 4. Why on earth would that have happened? Who can give me an answer? I'm puzzled now. Why is my set count plus 1 not working? My second one's not working, apparently. Well, only one of them's working. The second one's not working. Why is only one working? In other words, this one doesn't work. It had no effect. Why? Possibly cause this. Well, let's take a look at what's happening here. I've got my app component, and I render const count set count. So if I render this component for the very first time, it's going to, this function will return 0, because on the first call, it gives you back what you wanted or what you set the first time. So I called use state, it returned 0 and a function to change my state. Okay, so now count is 0. I'm going to click my button. I click this button. What's going to happen? It's going to call the on click, which is increment. Line 19, it's going to go to increment. Okay. Line 20, set count, count plus 1. Well, count is what? Count was 0 plus 1. Count is now 1. Next line, line 24, set count. Count is 0 plus 1. So does it again. 0 plus 1, So set count 1, set count 1. And that's exactly what's happening because count is a constant. This didn't render. It didn't render immediately because, as we know, JavaScript is single-threaded, which means nothing can happen in between these two lines of code, can it? It's impossible. So React can't, or JavaScript can't do anything until this particular callback is finished or when JavaScript is not busy. So set count, these happen right after one after the other, and it's a set count 1. So what's happening is count is stale. This is what's called stale state. Very common bug we find in our React code having stale state. Now here it's obvious because it's right here and right here. But this can be much more insidious. And you might be calling this increment function twice, or maybe you've got some code here, and then maybe there's a function where you call some do stuff function, and you're passing set count to it maybe, and down there in that function, it calls set count. But it didn't know that set count was called before. Can't know, can it? So it's not always as obvious as this when we have stale state. And we get weird results with stale state. Things don't change. Like, why, for example, why am I getting 3, 4, 5? I don't understand. And it's often a situation or a result of stale state. Because state can go stale on you. And it can be hard to catch. So turns out there's another way to call a set state function or a state setter function. The common way is just give it a value. So this is, of course, set count to 1, what I'm calling, right? Set count 1, right? Count plus 1 will be 1. That's the first way. So call your set state function with a value. The most common way. Another way to call your set state function, set count in this case, is give it a function. There. Give it a function. And it will set state to anything that function returns. Count plus 1. Does that do anything? Well, it doesn't fix my problem. Okay. So there's one more thing you get. As a parameter to your callback, you get back the previous one you saved. Guaranteed. So I'll just say preb plus 1. Now I'm guaranteed that when I call set count this time, this parameter or this callback that I get, a value I get, is guaranteed to be the latest and greatest version of count every time. So now goes up by 2. Yes, 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay. This is how we deal with stale state. Now, I would commonly kind of take these brackets out. It's an arrow function. Don't need to have the curly braces. I can take out the return. I can do this and make it a little bit cleaner. There we go. A little nicer. And it works the same, using the implied return of an arrow function. So that question is, well, which one do I use? Now I have 2 choices. And the answer is, it depends. If you really know there's only ever going to be one set count, this is perfectly fine. This one's simpler, so I use this to start with. I always start with this. Why not? But if I start noticing this is getting kind of complicated, or I might have called set count before, or I start getting some really crazy bugs, it doesn't make any sense, I then go ahead and change this to my use a prev. It doesn't hurt to always use this format. Nothing wrong with this. It's just a little more complex, that's all. So that is how we handle stale state. And you will come across it, definitely. Happens all the time. If things aren't changing on you and you can't figure out why, it's probably have some stale state. Okay, so that is how we take care of that. Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about how we would share state between some components. We've done this already, haven't we? I think in our tourney matches and our light mode, dark mode, I think we had a program doing that as well. We need to share some state. So let's make myself, I'm going to make myself a counter. In fact, let's take this. I'm going to grab this code right here and make myself a component for my counter, because it's getting kind of messy. Let's go ahead and I'll put it here. Call it counter.js. I could make a components folder, but I'm lazy today, so I can do that. Make a function. I'm going to call it counter. There. And I can probably copy and paste some code. I can take kind of this state right there. This looks like it all works fine with my counter. Take that and put that in there. Okay, and close it off. And being a component has to return something. So I'm going to return, what should I return? Well, my count. And I probably want my button as well. I'll put my button in there as well. My count and my button. Okay. Unerased for code detected. Okay, well, looks like in this case, I'm not returning a single parent, so I'll put it inside a div. There. And it's happy again. And I always forget to export default my counter, because I always forget that. Okay, and I'll probably import state. I'm going to go to the end here, go control space or command space, and auto import. I love that feature. It saves me a ton of typing. And don't need that anymore. Oh, looks like my counter is kind of working. Now I have a standalone counter that I can use over and over again. Let's go ahead and go to my app, and let's take all of my count stuff away now, which is kind of everything for now. There. And instead of my count, I'll put my counter component. There, okay. So take that out, and I'm going to put my counter inside there. Counter. And you'll probably see it on the list when you start typing it. If you don't see it there, it probably means you forgot to export it. If you start doing this, you get some weird, like, what the heck is that? Anybody had that happen? You start typing in VS Code, and all of a sudden you get some really long, crazy thing, like, what are you doing? So in this case, it's because perhaps I didn't export. No, I did. But if you don't see it on the list as you type, it probably means you didn't export it. And there it is, my counter. It auto imports it, which is very cool. There. And now I have a counter. And I do. Does it work? Woohoo! It works. Look at that. A masterpiece of software engineering. Goes up by 2. I'm going to make it go up by 1 just to make it a little better. And just to prove it, I'm going to do this. Nothing wrong with doing just this way as well. Okay. So works perfectly fine. And just for fun, I'm going to make some more functions, because now I have freedom to play, because now I work inside. I'll make a function called decrement and a function called clear. And decrement will go -1. And I don't need to use the prev version here. I'm just doing it because it was already there. And this will be just set count to 0, like this, unconditionally. So I'm going to make 2 more buttons. One is going to be, I'm going to call clear, and I'm going to make this one a minus button, a 0 button, and a plus button. And this is going to call decrement. Very cool. Wow. Oh, this is so cool. Look at that. Like a video game. I don't get a lot. To me, this is a cool video game. Okay. All right. And I wrote it, which is even more fun. So there, now I've got my kind of self-contained counter component. There we go. And it works. Make sure clear, plus, plus, plus. Oh yeah, working fantastic. Okay. What if I want to have two counters? Let's make two counters. There. Or three. Make two for now. I have two counters. Well, I'm going to get, of course, two counters. And you notice they don't share state. And maybe that's what I wanted in this case. I want them to not share state. But what if I do want them to share state? Well, each counter is an instance of this function, isn't it? We talked about that. Every counter here, this is like my function all over again. Called my function twice. Each of these are completely separate instances of counter. So they don't share anything. Well, what if I want to share something? What do I need to do? Well, we know this, don't we? We did this in our exercise. What do we do when we need to share state between sibling components? What should we do? What's a great way? Yeah, we push up, we take that state and we push it up one level. So I've got a diagram here. It doesn't quite match, but it's kind of similar. What I have is this. Let's say I had some stuff in between, and then my app and my counters, and maybe some pages in between just for fun, okay? So I've got these two counter components, and they have their own state. So I need to push that state up, but I can't quite give it to the parent because now it's going to be here. It still can't be shared, can it? So if the count of my state ends up here, it still can't be shared because there's no way to get across to each one of these parents or each one of these children because login is not a parent of this counter and info is not a parent of this counter. So I have to do something else. I have to find what? I have to find what the closest thing that they have in common. And that is called the closest common ancestor. Perfect day for it. Halloween and vampires, right? Remember our vampires? Closest common ancestor. That is what we do here too. We have to find the closest common ancestor of both of them. In this case, the closest common ancestor is app. And of course, the my app as well. It's more obvious. App is the parent. So app is the closest common ancestor. We need to take all that state and put it in the closest common ancestor here. It needs to be in app. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. So let's take app and we'll take our counter state and we'll put it back in app. Okay, so put it right here in app. There. Okay, which means we're going to remove it from our counter. Okay, but now it's not going to compile because, well, nothing's going to work, right? Count is not defined and set count's not defined. So it looks like this isn't going to work. It looks like these functions have to follow the state with it, don't they? So what I have to do is I have all of these state. I also have functions, which also have to end up in app as well. Not just the state, but the functions that change that state. They should also follow the state. So these have to go too. There. Those have to also go in app along with the state. So functions that change state should follow the state itself. We'll talk more about this. This is a very important concept, okay? But these three functions, increment, decrement, clear, should be alongside the state that they modify. Well, I have even more problems. Now nothing's defined. Count, decrement, can't find anything. None of this stuff exists. So now I have to do what? I have to find a way to get the count and these functions back down to this counter. To do that, of course, I do this. I have to pass the state and the functions down to the children, okay, as what? It's a parameter. So we call those props, don't we? We have to pass it as props. So I have to pass to each counter now, count equals count. There. And count equals count. There. Now that works. But now in my counter, I have to give it some props. And I want to render props.count. I'm passing an object now, so it's props.count. Great. What solved one problem? Now it says, well, decrement's not defined. Clear. These three functions are also undefined. So it looks like I have to call props.decrement and props.clear and props.increment. There. And it's going to work, but as soon as I click something, I'm going to get an error because it's going to say, well, it's undefined. There it is. It's not defined. So I have to, of course, now pass those props to my counter component here. Increment. I'll make it multi-line. Any more than two things, I always put on a separate line. So increment equals my increment function there. And I'll just do this. Copying, pasting always gets me into trouble. And I've never learned my lesson in all these years, because I always think this time it'll work for sure. There. And I'll just make a copy because they're pretty much the same now. I have two counters and I'm passing my state and my state functions down with it. Okay, so let's refresh that. And no errors. Let's take a look. And now, of course, it's shared state. They're both talking to the same state. And we do that, of course, by passing these props. This is fine if it's a direct parent-child relationship. Totally fine. Now, this particular example is not a direct parent-child relationship. I've got my props passing through some intermediate component, login and info, whatever those things are. And this has a specific name in React. And it's called prop drilling. We had to drill through login in order for counter to get these props. And the same with the info. We had to pass these props down through info, which might not even care about them. And info had to pass them down along to counter. Prop drilling. It is not a good thing. It's considered poor design. 2 levels is okay. 3 is pushing it. Okay, 4 or 5, we got a problem on our hands. Okay, so I can live with 2, maybe 3. And I'm pretty sure in the project we'll be starting, I think we go down, 2 or 3, and that's as far as we go. There is a way to remedy this. We will not cover that this week or next week. We'll cover that a lot later. We'll give you another lecture on another React pattern we can use to eliminate this problem. But for now, our purpose is to learn about props. So we give you some kind of complicated prop drilling examples in the Photo Labs project that will be starting very shortly. But this works for now. It is now shared state. Okay. Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about this concept of interface versus implementation functions. Now, you may have said to yourself, why on earth is Gary passing all 3 of these functions down? Why not just pass set state equals set state? There. That'd be easier, wouldn't it? And same with this. Why not just pass set state? And then have my counter call set state, or even have its own functions, right? So now it has props.setState. And let the counter worry about increment, decrement, and clear, like this. There. And actually be called props dot. There. And we'll say const. Always call it props dot. There. There we go. Props dot. And just call props dot set count all the way down. There. Make sure that works. How's it look? And oh, hold on, let me quickly. I would type set state someplace in says in app.js. I type set state. Oh, set count. There. Okay, there. Okay, and double check, set count, and counter. I would never do this, that's why it's not working that well. So, oh, of course, and of course I call it increment. There. There. This is so bad, I wouldn't really advise this. Okay. But it does work. And it's a lot less code. Now I only pass one thing down. But we would never do this. We would never do this because now we are exposing outside of our state. Later on, we'll talk about combining state into a module of its own. And these things should stay together. But now what we have is the details of how increment is done is bleeding out of our state here into other components. And now they need to know how state is implemented or how a counter is implemented. So now counter needs to know, oh yeah, it's a set count function. And by the way, it's a set state, which means I may have to do a prev as well. I can't just go count plus one. Props.count. Because it might be stale. So I probably should do this. So now this is called breaking what's called separation of concerns. This component should not know the details of how count is implemented. It should simply see what's called interfaces, which is why we'd never do it this way. Let's undo this. So instead of this, let's do it the proper way. There. And this way. I think I've got them all. I do. So what we have here, these are interface functions. In other words, they take care of all the gory details of how an increment happens. Maybe there's more stuff going on here. Maybe there's some kind of fetch where we do, HTTP something. I don't know, set count.com or something, right? Who knows what we do? Maybe it's not state at all. Maybe there is no state. Maybe increment doesn't even do state at all. It does some API call. Okay, so these details should not bleed out of your component or the area, or in this case, it's a component that maintains that state. You should pass these interface functions. Very important concept. And it's very easy to do. In other words, it's very easy to break that concept and try to pass things like set count. So in your photo labs, for instance, you may have some favorites. Maybe you've got a const favorites and set favorites. There, equals use state, and maybe I've got an empty array. There's my favorites. Okay, so I've got some favorites. Now, it'd be easy to simply pass set favorites, wouldn't it, to all the way down the tree. But that would not be a good idea. For example, I want to find out if something's being favorited. Okay. Is something a favorite? Okay. Well, I would simply pass favorites down to every single item and let them figure out if their ID exists inside this array. But a better solution would make a function called isFavorite. That takes an ID. And I'd return perhaps favorites includes, for instance, includes the ID. Simple little piece of code. There. And now I have an interface function that takes care of if something's a favorite, because maybe this is a database lookup. Maybe it's something much more complex. If you pass favorites, you're now passing a hard-coded implementation of favorites all the way down to your other components. But isFavorite could be anything. It could be API call, couldn't it, right? Which then gets it from some kind of API. Similarly, maybe I'd make a function called toggle favorite, which takes an ID, which also maybe does some stuff. Maybe if it's, well, isFavorite, if it's there already, would remove, right? And then add the favorite. There. And that works. And of course, set state, of course, at the end, naturally. It's always set state. And these are interface functions. In other words, they don't give away the trade secret of how we handle favorites. That's our secret. No one needs to know that. We just pass them an interface. isFavorite, toggle favorite, and those details, no one needs to know. So this is an important concept when you're coding React, okay? Or really coding anything in general, but it's doubly important in React when we're passing props down. Okay. Any questions on this concept? This is an important one, okay? I see too often people passing implementation details down to components and then getting themselves in a big hole in a hurry. So when in doubt, make a function that hides all the details and then pass that down. You'll find it's pretty useful. Okay, let's do something else. There's something else a little more fun. So let's give our favorites. Don't need these. There. For now, how's our code doing? Is it surviving? It is. Okay, good. And have I got my rendering app? So I should get my, yep, still has rendering app. Sounds good. Okay. Why don't we try something more interesting? What if I do a clear? So there's my rendering app. Makes it a little bigger so we can see it. And by the way, fun fact about DevTools, as we probably already know, there is a React DevTools inside your browser. If you haven't got so already, you can go to Components. Let's go there really quickly. And I'm going to make this bigger. There, we can see it. There we go. Okay. There's app. Now, by default, this pane is way over here on the right. Totally pointless. So the first thing you should do is take this pane, drag it all the way about 3/4 of the way there. 1/4, 3/4. All the exciting stuff is on the right. All that's on the left is just names. So first thing you should do is just drag it on the left. Okay. It shows me my app. I have my title inside app, and then I have 2 counters. Counter has some props, and you can see, of course, the props that you're getting. Right now it's 12. And this counter is also getting a prop of 12. And my title just has a prop, and my app has some state. You'll see a title called, or a section called hooks. I have 1 state. Now you notice it doesn't tell me the name of the state, it just says state. That's it. And then 12. So state number 1 is 12. How does React know that. Well, let's add some more. Let's add a second, just for fun. We'll add a second state, and we'll start off with a value of 1. There. There's my app, and now I have 2 states. State number 1, state number 2, 0 and 1. You notice it doesn't know the names of those states. Well, of course, it can't know because these names are only local to this scope. So there's no way React could know those names. This is a local variable. Let's call it count. But React, of course, and DevTools, that's way outside of my code. It can't know these names. It just knows there's the first one and there's the second one. That's all it knows. And of course, the third. We'll do 3 for fun. There. Okay. And as we change our state, we can see a change. There, 1, 2, 3, 4. Very cool. Okay. One of the rules of hooks. Okay. Oh, the question is it installed by default? It's in a Chrome extension. Some browsers, I think Firefox had it by, I can't remember if I installed it by default or not, but it's easy to install. You simply Google for React DevTools in your browser and they install easily. So let's talk about rules of hooks. And there's some very specific rules about calling React hooks, of which useState is one. The number 1 rule is hooks must always be called in the exact same order every single time. State 1, because React doesn't know. It simply knows this is the first one, the second one, and the third one. So if I shuffle up the order next time, for instance, I put an if statement. Maybe I put in an if. I'll say if count. And maybe I'll only do a set or use state for count 1 if I have a non-zero count. Let's take a look. Okay, let's take a look. Well, I'm getting some nasty thing here. That probably tells me there's an error. Let's look at my browser. What's it saying here? Oh, okay. It says useState is called conditionally. React hooks must be called in the exact same order in every render. In other words, you cannot call hooks inside conditionals. We cannot do that. So that is a big no-no. It won't even run. It notices that you get a nasty scolding from React saying, don't do that. So we can't do that. Okay. Another rule of hooks is that hooks must only be called inside React components. You can't call them in things like helper functions, not technically, okay? So if I made a helper function that had useState in it, it would also say, well, you can't do that. You can't call useState in a helper function. It can only be called in a React component. There's one other exception to that, and we'll talk about that, I believe, in a couple of lectures from now. We talk about hooks. But right now, we can only call hooks inside React components. There is one other rule, which is a pretty easy one. React hooks must start with use. So they must start with USE. Any hook has to start with use. We will be doing a section on writing our own hooks later on. They're called custom hooks, which are super fun, by the way. I know, custom hooks, are you kidding me? We have to start writing our own React hooks. We can barely use the ones we're given. Now we have to write some. You crazy? Turns out that's actually pretty simple. It's one of the easiest concepts of React is custom hooks. Okay. So those are our 3 rules of hooks. Okay. And of course, the reason for the order is that, we go there, back to our console, there. Because React only tracks the, there we go, only tracks the order. It can't know the names. So it has to know which order they're in, of course. Okay, let's try something else. Let's refresh our page. There, there's my state. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. There, and I probably got a bunch of rendering apps. So I know if I press clear, it will render my app again, won't it? Let's press clear. Rendering app. And my state of my count went to 0 because I know in my clear I did set count to 0. Okay. Click it again. Click. Did I miss one? Click. It's not rendering. Click, 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 click. I'm clicking, by the way. It's not rendering. My application or my component is not rendering, even though clearly, let's just make sure. Let's just calling set count 0, just to be absolutely sure. And we'll actually console log that. There. How's that look? Okay, now I gotta make it really clear. I should be calling it. So let's go give some stuff, clear that. Okay, let's click clear. It worked. Calling set count, rendering app. Awesome. Let's do it again. Okay. Oh, it didn't work. Everything this is going up. I'm calling set my console log, but it's not rendering. I'm just console logging all the time. It's not rendering. What could possibly be happening here? And this is another core concept of React. I'm clearly calling set count. So we do know that what caused the render is really calling set state, right? Calling set state should trigger a render, but it's not. Oops, it's my app. There it is. So clearly, simply calling set count is not enough to trigger a render. Anyone can guess what is then? I thought that'd trigger render, but it doesn't. This does not trigger a re-render of my app. And why? Because it's not simply calling set count, it is a change of state. When I click, I'm going set count 0, and then set count 0 again, and set count 0 again. So what React does, React notices, well, count's already 0. So are you saying set count 0? There's no change here. Nothing to see here. I'm not going to render. I'm sorry. And that's exactly what happens. So React notices that there's no actual change of state. Set count is 0. You set count 0 again, it doesn't render. So this can happen a lot in your code. Why is nothing rendering? I expect this to render. Maybe you have something else going on. Nothing happened. Maybe you have an Axios call or some kind of API call here. You expect to happen on your next render. It doesn't happen. That's because React only renders on a change of state. Okay, now this is fine for things like values. But when we start getting more complex data structures like objects and arrays, then it becomes an issue. I'm going to make a little bit of code here, and then we'll carry on with this in the next session. For those of you in the Flex, you have two choices. I will send you the video to part 2 of this lecture, which I have recorded already, or you're certainly welcome to come tomorrow morning at the same time, and we'll go through it again. But we'll start with a bit of this. Let's demonstrate this now with maybe an array. Let's build ourselves an array. So what I want to do is I want to make myself, let's take a counter out of here for now. Let's do one counter there. Leave this counter, and I'm gonna leave this stuff in here for now. I'm gonna make myself a list. I want to render a list on my browser. So let's go here and we'll render a list, UL. There. And presumably we're going to have some kind of list of items inside this. Const list equals, and we'll do something later. For now, I'll just put an array with some LIs inside it. LI and LI item, just for fun. Okay, and I'll render my list in curly braces. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, you notice that I just got the word item. So I've got my JavaScript, then I switched to markup mode, which means this has to have a curly brace in it. Okay. And by the way, if for some reason I then added some more markup in here, for whatever reason, I could add a span, which won't work because it's going to violate the one parent rule. I'd have to then switch back to curly braces again. Because whenever you switch from markup mode to JavaScript mode, markup, I have to switch to JavaScript using curly braces. Okay. And item is not defined, so I'll just say quote item for now. There. So I've got an item in there. So I'm going to have some data in my list. So what I want to do is I want to type something in. Make myself a really simple little control. I'll put it right here. Put an input here. There. Type equals text. There. And I can type stuff in. There we go. Okay. And we know with React inputs, what do I need to do? I need to have them managed or controlled, right? Which means I have to link this input to some state. Because right now, React has no idea what's going on in the input. I can type stuff. React has no idea what's happening. If this was jQuery, I could maybe my onClick go and grab that context, like with the counter, and then use it. But this is not jQuery. This is a React. Everything is declarative, which means it's all to do with state. So I need to have some state that will hold my input. Just make it a little smaller. So I need some state. We'll call it text with an empty string. So now I'm going to link this input to this text. And two things we do, right? We do value equals the text, state, and we do what else? What's the second thing we always have to do? Value and on change, exactly. On change equals and a function. Now we have two choices. We can make ourselves a function, which when I'm starting out, that's what I do. I'll make a function and I'll call it on change. It can be called anything, honestly. Okay. That takes event as a parameter. And I go set text to event.target.value, the only one I know of event and target because I've done it so many times. I just memorized it. Let's call it E there. Or event. Okay. On change, and now my on change can be that. And now when I type, I have my state changing. Let's watch that happen. Let's go to my state. And as I type, there. There it is. Kind of small, but you can kind of see it down there. Sometimes what I do is I'll go as far to actually put in my input, I'll just put the text right there. So I can just see visually what I'm doing on my page. I find it's easier there. So if I type, this should change, right? It is. So state changing. I find this is faster than looking at DevTools. And once I'm happy, I just delete that line. So I usually put this temporary code here just to see that my input's all hooked up. And yes, it is. It's all hooked up. Now, what we could do, since this is pretty short, we don't need to have a named function. It's easier, but on really short ones, you can probably put this as an anonymous function. So take that and instead do this. There. So why wouldn't I just say set text like this? Well, now this is actually calling the function immediately here. This needs to be a function. So the question is, well, when do I use a name function and when do I do inline? Well, generally, if this is something simple, inline's fine. Or if they have different parameters. In other words, this on change is called by the DOM. And you're right, I have either. It's called by the DOM, and the DOM will pass me the event. But my set text doesn't take event. My set text takes a string. So sometimes we have no choice in doing this. I'll demonstrate this probably tomorrow in our next lecture, a situation where we actually can't use a named function at all. We have to use this, this format. And it works the same thing. Don't need the parentheses for my event anymore. And this works perfectly fine. We'll do it this way for now, although I tend to like doing this because when I'm just starting out, I find this easier to understand like this. But one thing you shouldn't do is don't put any more than this. If you got some complex code, do not put it in line. If you got multi-line code that is a whole bunch of stuff or big long map statement, please don't embed that inside your JSX. It just messes up your JSX and it's hard to read. So if they're very short, this is fine. If they're anything more than a one-liner, it belongs in its own function for sure. Okay, this is fine because it is short. So there we go. So that one for now. Okay, there's my input. So now I want to make a button and I want to add something to my my list. Let's go ahead and make a button here. Make a div here. And make a button there. I know this is messy markup. Okay, got a button and let's make it, call this add. There we go. So when I click this button, it should add, if I say hello world, I want to add to my list. Sounds reasonable. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and make a function to do that, an on-click function that will add something to our list. And put this here, I'll call this function add item. And our on click is going to call that add item. On click equals add item. How we doing? Any nasty errors? No, it looks pretty good. Okay, things are working. So far, so good. Don't need to have my set counter anymore. So now let's go ahead and take a look. Oh, we're getting this error. Look at this. Every child should have a unique key prop. This is a warning. It's not a fatal error. It's just React saying, hey, I can't keep track of these items. What's going on? You should have a key prop, which we'll do in a second. We'll do it the ugly way in a minute. So now, instead of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to map my items. I want to have an array of items. So I have another state here. And I'll call this my, what should I call this? My items. Items there as an array. And this is going to contain my items, which I'm going to map here. So now it's going to be the React developer's best friend, which is items.map. .map is our best friend. There. Okay. And for every item, or I guess, I'll say item a little more verbose. For every item, I'm going to return an li. Come on. There we go. I should close. There we go. Which contains, well, the item. There. Simple enough. It's a pretty simple li. Okay. And now I have an empty array. I'm all set. So if I click my button, I want to add to that array, and I should see my new item show up. Okay. So let's go ahead and add. Well, items dot push, add to an array, right? And we'll push the text there. So we're going to go ahead and then we're going to call our set items, make sure we update our state, set items to items. So we've changed our items. We're going to push it back or put it back into React. Okay. And click add, and we don't get anything. Add. What's going on? Let's just console log our items. What's going on? Okay. Let's try again. Hello. Add. Okay, and any key prop. Yes, I know that. Got one hello. Add again. How's my hello growing? It's growing. My array does have 4 things, but nothing is rendering again. So that is our topic for our next lecture on why this didn't happen. Clearly, I've got a new array, but it's not rendering at all. So that's the end of part 1 of state. We'll pick up again tomorrow. For those of you in Flex, I will send the lecture to part 2, but you are welcome to come tomorrow as well. And I'll post the lecture link for the Zoom link then. All right, everyone, that is our end of part 1 of state.